I'm going to be giving a short session today on the updated guidance on interpreting and assessing imprecision with grade methods. This is based on the paper that was published in 2022. And for those of us who attended the Cochrane colloquium in September of 23, there was a workshop there that the authors of the paper also presented. So just a quick overview of what I'm going to do today. So we're just going to have a quick recap on what imprecision means in grade terms, and then obviously what's changed according to new guidance and the application of new guidance, its impact and consequences. And to start off, just a quick definition of what imprecision is, and I think this darts photo might be particularly topical for those of us in the UK, at least, because it was the World Darts Championship recently, and a 16-year-old made it to the final, Luke Littler, so it's been in the news a lot. But as you can see from those aren't his dart throws, by the way, but as you can see, they're very, very precise dart throwing. So when we think about imprecision in the context of grade, the question we're really asking is, would your clinical action change if either the upper or lower boundary of the 95% confidence interval represented the truth? And there's a few things that we normally consider. So this is based on the old guidance of what you normally do for grade. So you look at the width of your 95% confidence intervals. You would consider clinically important differences and also the optimal information size. So this is whether your meta-analysis is appropriately powered. And then you may also look at anticipated absolute effects. So what does this mean in practice? Some of you may remember that I gave a web clinic about a year ago now on both imprecision and inconsistency. And these are some teaching slides that we used to use at Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. So I gave this example previously, and this is based on the review of artesunate versus quinine in severe malaria. So 2 drugs to treat severe malaria, and this forest plot shows the outcome of death. And as you can see here, it shows a 38% reduction in death for the group that takes artesunate compared to the group that took quinine. And from here, you can see from the 95% confidence intervals, which just a quick overview of what that means is if we were to rerun these trials 100 times, 95 times out of those 100, we would expect your result to lie within these boundaries. So anything between a 25% reduction in death to a 49% reduction in death. Now, applying the old guidance that we're used to with imprecision, we can see here quite clearly that there's quite tight confidence intervals, and both a 25% reduction in death and a 49% reduction in death are both important reductions. So they're both clinically significant. So we would be tempted not to downgrade at all for imprecision here. Moving on to another example, again from the same review, but this time looking at neurological disability at discharge. You can see quite obviously the confidence intervals are absolutely massive, so we would definitely downgrade, and I would probably downgrade by 2. And then finally, before we touch on the new guidance, so this separate review that's looking at 2 different types of combination drugs for malaria, and the outcome here is serious adverse events. And what you can see here is that there's very low event rates, and this is quite typical for systematic reviews that are looking at serious adverse events. The confidence intervals around a relative effects are therefore very wide, and this is driven by the low event rates. But also, sample sizes themselves are quite large. So comparing against the previous example where you had very wide confidence intervals and it was an obvious downgrade by two, this one is a bit between whether they're wide or very wide, but you can also tell that it's driven by very low event rates. So a combined total of 20 event rates across the two arms. So for this, I would downgrade by two here, one for the wide confidence intervals and another one for low event rates. So the meta-analysis is not sufficiently powered. So what's new? And as I mentioned at the start, I'm basing this off one of the papers from the Grade Guidance series that's published by the Grade Working Group. And this was published, I think, towards the tail end of 2022. And most of my examples are derived from here. But you're welcome to look at the paper yourself afterwards, and there are more examples in there. So I mentioned previously about the things that we should consider when thinking about imprecision as a domain in grade. And the new guidance draws particular importance to two things: clinically important differences and anticipated absolute effects. There's also an important caveat to add in that now you can downgrade by three for imprecision where you have really massive confidence intervals and the result is just so imprecise that you really don't know and you're not confident in certainty at all. So let's try and unpick this and see what it means in practice. So again, those of you that came to my last web clinic when I discussed imprecision might remember this figure. And essentially this figure is showing figurative forest plots of relative effects, where we consider clinically important differences for what is an appreciable harm and what is an appreciable benefit, which on here we've set to 25%. So anything above 1.25, we consider it to be a clinically important harm, and anything below 0.75, we consider to be a clinically important benefit. And this is important to keep in mind for this new approach, because in the new way of thinking about imprecision, we need to talk about what is called a minimally contextualized approach. So this is when systematic review authors consider only one outcome at a time, and the authors will then rate their certainty in relation to the null rating. So the certainty that an effect is truly present in relation to a minimally important difference. So quite similar to this. So the minimally important difference here would be the 25% threshold, so 1.25 and 0.75. And as you can see on the far left result, if you had a point estimate and both 95% thresholds across the appreciable benefit, then we might consider this precise result. So we wouldn't downgrade for imprecision at all, because whether you're looking at your upper or lower bound of the confidence interval, they're both clinically important. And again, with the reverse, if you imagine there was a result here where the point estimate and both the bounds 95% confidence interval were within appreciable harms, they were both above 1.25, then we would also consider this a precise result. Now, for the ones that cross over this threshold, that's when we can start talking about whether they're imprecise or not. So if you consider this one that my mouse is hovering over now, you've got a point estimate that is trivial, so it doesn't cross this what we would call the minimally important difference. But the lower bound of the 95% confidence interval does, whereas the upper bound is also within what we consider trivial. So this is a case where we would call this an imprecise result. So you're not confident whether your true result lies all within uh, the minimally important difference. So to illustrate this better, here are some examples taken directly from the grade paper. And this in particular is actually a plot of anticipated absolute effects. So one of the things I mentioned previously is that authors should now consider uh, anticipated absolute effects rather than relative effects when thinking about imprecision. And so this is a plot of anticipated absolute effects, and it's based on a meta-analysis of RCTs that yielded a pooled effect size. And the findings here show that corticosteroids yielded 2.2 fewer deaths per 100 patients with a confidence interval from 4.1 fewer to 0 fewer. So we consider the importance of the outcome and using a minimally contextualized approach. The authors may have set a minimally important difference, so i.e. the threshold of interest, a reduction of 0.5 deaths per 100, so or 5 deaths per 1,000 patients, and that's what the red dotted line represents. So anything that crosses that red dotted line means it's a clinically important benefit. So again, as you can see here, because our point estimate falls above the minimally important difference, if you were the author, you would be tempted to rate this certainty that corticosteroids result in an important reduction in death. And this is due to the fact that the confidence interval and the point estimate crosses this red dotted line. However, because the upper bound of the confidence intervals is within the trivial margin, so it doesn't cross this red dotted line, then we're uncertain whether the true effect lies all within what we would consider a clinically important benefit. So now we're thinking, do we downgrade by 1 or by 2? I would probably not be tempted to downgrade by 2 here because, firstly, the extent that the confidence interval crosses the threshold is relatively modest. So, and again, the minimally important difference here is 0.5. And you can see here the crossing of it is again only 0.5. And secondly, the confidence interval does not include an increase in deaths of corticosteroids. So everything falls within a benefit for the intervention, and nothing is showing harm. So it might be anything ranging from a trivial benefit to a clinically important benefit. So for that reason, I would downgrade by 1 here and not by 2. So I often find the best way to do grade is to do it yourself. So here's another example from the same review. The outcome is death again. And now we have a minimally important difference for both benefit and for harm. So what would people consider here? So feel free to type your answer into chat about whether you would downgrade by 1 for imprecision, by 2, or not at all. Or by 3. That was well reminded. Even I forgot you can downgrade by 3 now. So I think most people are leaning on 2 and 3. Um, and obviously, I should caveat this by saying there's no right answer with grade, right? As long as you justify your decisions and make them transparent, then normally people are happy. Um, but I would personally downgrade by 2 here, and I think for reasons that people have already mentioned. So unlike the previous example, this one you've got the width confidence interval both crosses the minimal important difference for both benefit and for harm. Whereas in the previous example, there was no inclusion of corticosteroids for harm. The point estimate still lies within what is considered clinically important um, benefit, and the lower bound as well, confidence interval is also within that. But the upper bound, the distance from the upper bound to the point estimate ranges from minimally important difference for benefit, a trivial result, and it just touches above a minimally important difference for harm. As some of you have said, you would downgrade by 3 rather than 2, and again, there's no right answer for grade as long as you can defend your position. I personally wouldn't downgrade by 3 here because if you consider the overall impact of grade, we're not just looking at this singular domain, we're looking at multiple domains. And I will touch on this later on. But when you're writing up your conclusions from grade results, we often use we don't know for very low certainty of effect. And I think downgrading for 3 should be reserved for when you have extremely wide confidence intervals. Okay, let's do another one. So in this case, we've got a trivial effect with possibility of substantial important harm. So give everyone a minute to just type in the chat what they would downgrade by. Would you downgrade by 1, 2, or 3? Or you might not downgrade at all. That's also an option. Great. So we've got quite a range between 1 to 3 here. So using a minimally contextualized approach again, the authors here have set a threshold for the minimal important difference. And remember, this plot is showing an anticipated absolute effect rather than a relative effect. So they've set the minimally important difference at 1% here. Now, like I said at the start of this slide, there's a trivial effect. So the point estimate is trivial, 0.5% increase in the number of strokes. And the lower bound for this confidence interval is also trivial, so minus 0.3%. So it doesn't cross this minimally important difference for benefit. But the upper bound definitely crosses the minimally important difference for harm, and it's very high. It's at 4.3%. So because it crosses that threshold, we know this is an imprecise result. But how imprecise is it? Well, there's a few things to consider here. And again, I personally wouldn't downgrade by 3 because the range of results isn't wide enough. But we're all most of us are probably considered whether we downgrade by 1 or 2. So what can we consider? Is 4.3% increase in stroke large enough to warrant rating down 2 levels for imprecision? So there's several ways you might go about this. First of all, you might consider how much do patients value this outcome. If it's an outcome that's incredibly valued by both patients and also a guideline group, then this 4.3% increase might be incredibly important. And this is particularly important, not just in this specific example, but for other examples. So previously, we were looking at outcomes of death and relating it back to malaria, the difference between outcomes of death, for example. So if you had a 25% decrease in mortality versus a 25% decrease in prevalence of a disease, there's such a difference in those two outcomes. And quite obviously, patients would value mortality more. So you might take that into consideration when thinking about the magnitude of the effect and whether it's downgrade by 1 or 2. And like I said, magnitude of the increase is also important to consider here. So would it represent a moderate or large effect? So quite obviously, the larger the magnitude, the more likely it is you would choose to downgrade by 2. Finally, another approach that you could consider is the plain language statements that would accompany decisions regarding whether to downgrade by 1 or by 2. So would you be comfortable with a statement that is likely that corticosteroids have trivial or no effects on stroke when it remains possible that corticosteroids result in a 4.3 increase? Or would you be more comfortable to say that it may result in little or no effect on stroke with a downgrade by 2 just for imprecision because there may be a 4.3 increase? So from that lot, so all things considered here, I would downgrade by 2 for imprecision for this one. But again, it's tricky and not so clear cut. Moving on. So at the moment we've only spoken about imprecision from using a minimally contextualized approach and using these thresholds to help us consider from anticipated absolute effects whether your result is imprecise or not. Now, previously with grade guidance, another thing to consider when talking about imprecision was the optimal information size. And as I said before, this is how appropriately powered is your meta-analysis to find an effect. Now, with the new guidance, the grade working group suggests that we should only consider the optimal information size when the confidence interval does not cross your thresholds for minimal difference for both benefit and harm, but your relative effect is large. The general rule of thumb that we normally say to authors with an optimal information size is that if you have a combined number of events of 300 and above, then you can safely assume that your meta-analysis is appropriately powered to detect any effect, no matter how small. There's also some hard rules presented in the new paper about always downgraded by 2 for imprecision. And this is the case if for dichotomous outcomes, the ratio of the upper to lower boundary of your confidence interval is more than 2.5 times for odds ratios and 3 for risk ratio. And for continuous outcomes, when the total sample size of a meta-analysis is smaller than 30 to 50% of the optimal information size that's calculated from a power calculation. I won't go into too much detail on how to calculate a power calculation here because firstly, I'm not a statistician, so um, I probably wouldn't be able to do it justice. But we do have statisticians on call here that I'm sure will be able to help if you have questions about that. Right, so let's bring this round to what grade really means and the impact of grade on your review. So as we know, imprecision is only one of the four commonly assessed domains for grade, with the additional fifth being normally publication bias. And at the end, when you've graded for all your domains, you can you come out with one single result on how certain you are of the findings of your review. So that ranges from high to very low. High being we have a lot of confidence that the true effect is similar to the estimated effect, all the way down to very low in that the true effect is probably very different from the estimated effect. Thinking back to our example of artesunate for malaria, the powerful thing about grade is that once you've done all this, you can conclude your findings with one sentence essentially. So if you have a high certainty, you can quite confidently say that artesunate reduces mortality compared to quinine. And again, this rate goes all the way down to very low, where you're not certain of your result at all. So you simply say, we don't know if artesunate reduces mortality. And with the new guidance and the ability to downgrade by 3 for imprecision, this is particularly helpful for the rare cases where you have confidence intervals that are so wide that irrespective of any other domains in grade, it's just so wide that you can't really be certain at all what your true effect is. So you can downgrade by 3 and say, we don't know. So what's the impact of this new guidance and using a minimally contextualized approach, considering anticipated absolute effects? Well, in general, we should be seeing more downgrades by 2 for imprecision now, with thresholds for both benefits and harms. But from the examples I presented today, there are a few things that you have to consider as well, including the magnitude of the effect, how comfortable you would be concluding the difference between what may be a moderate certainty to a low certainty of effect, and also the importance of the outcome that you're assessing. And like I mentioned before, the flexibility to downgrade by 3, leading to more we don't knows. So just to summarize, so now when we think about imprecision from grade context, we should use a minimally contextualized approach and focus on anticipated absolute effects rather than relative effects. When thinking about the optimal information size, we should only really consider this when relative effects are large and confidence intervals don't cross the thresholds of interest. And just to really bring home that point that you can now downgrade by 3 for imprecision.